Welcome to the Resilience Report, where we go beyond the headlines to spotlight the trailblazers redefining sustainable business. I'm your host, Lauren Scott. In each episode, I sit down with ecopreneurs and lighthouse leaders, visionaries, who are tackling our planet's toughest challenges and proving that business can be a force for good. Thanks for joining me as we explore what's possible and what's next on the path to a more resilient future. 13 years into working in the building automation space, I had a sustainability realization I did not see coming. And it took moving across an ocean, sweating through a heat wave in a country famous for its rain, for me to get here. This one's a solo episode, just me, a story, and a shift in how I think about the work we do in this industry. So let's get into it. Welcome back to another episode of the Resilience Report. This is typically where I introduce one of our incredible guests. However, this week it's just me. And it's because I had a moment that felt so honest and important as part of my sustainability journey that I really wanted to share it with you, our listeners. And a quick legal disclaimer, a reminder that this podcast, overall, the Resilience Report, is truly a passion project for myself. It only represents my own opinions and does not necessarily reflect the organization that I work for. However, I really wanted to share today's episode, not about my specific company, but about the industry in which I work more broadly. So here's a story. 13 years ago, I started in the building automation industry, the smart building industry. Sometimes you might hear it referred to as the building management systems industry or BMS. This is essentially where we help control the HVAC or the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning of a built space. We can sometimes touch as well on lighting and blind control, but really kind of creating that smarter space for a building. And I've been being honest with myself, and I've said this probably on several platforms at this point, the piece that has really always been my why has been the environmental side from day one. I remember the night before I applied for the job back in 2013, couldn't sleep. I felt like this is finally it. This is the job that I was meant to work in, and that I was having a positive impact on my community and the environment through this truly environmental space. It was, at the time, I'll be honest, a little bit of an obscure industry because the controls and sensors and software are often very much behind the scene of a building. So while we all kind of benefit from them, we don't necessarily get to experience them or realize that we're experiencing them because they're behind the ceilings and walls. And for me, what I really, really loved was that this technology allowed buildings to use less energy, to put less pressure on the grid, and ultimately to have less emissions, especially as so many countries currently have not yet made the transition to cleaner energy. So for me, that's always been the concrete win when people ask me why I've been working in this industry for over a decade now. Occupant comfort on the other side of the equation, however, has always been a little bit more of a distant second. And I want to be really careful here because the reality is that I truly do care about the individuals within the built space. So whether that is a student who has better learning outcomes because of the environment in which they're studying, or a patient who can heal faster in a hospital because of the environmental conditions, those are obviously critically important. However, as somebody who is very much mission-driven, the area in which I really felt like I could throw my passion behind was always that environmental side. And I felt like the comfort was maybe just a little bit of a softer side when it came to what our industry can provide overall. So that's honestly kind of the confession side, and then what led up to this broader kind of aha moment. So for a reminder for our listeners who maybe are not aware of this, I moved to Ireland back in October of 2025. It's been about 10 months at this point. And within the past couple of weeks, we've experienced what is almost a record-breaking heat wave here in Ireland. Last time it was this hot for this long was 50 years ago in 1976. And Cork has just come within 1/10 of a degree of this record. And so for context, I grew up in Montreal, and summers, it was regularly mid-30s. In the winter, we could even hit kind of low mid-40s Celsius. So it kind of made sense when people here locally were like, oh, you must be really used to this heat. You're from Canada, you're from Montreal. It must be very normal for you, and you must almost even enjoy it for the summer. And I totally got this, but at the same time, I didn't. Because the honest answer is that we actually have the infrastructure in place to be able to navigate these extremes, both hot and cold. Air conditioning really became a standard, I'd say, for most households probably about 15 years ago or so, at least for our family. We definitely didn't have it growing up. However, within the past decade and a half, you would just see that most homes really do require it, and we're able to do the installation. Sometimes also with heat pumps, for example, you do the swap in. Government had different programs in place to be able to allow this transition to both heat and cool the space. Reality is that Ireland, and honestly much of Europe, and I'm sure most of the world, have not necessarily had this luxury of installing the technology as it became available, and is now playing a little bit of catch up when we're facing these situations with extreme heat. And I really felt this gap directly over the past few weeks, which was where this episode originally came from, because our apartment here was way too hot. It was built exactly for the conditions that you would expect here in Ireland, which is to keep the dampness out and to keep the warmth in. And what happened was, as a result of this and the extended heat day over day, was that our kitchen was regularly hitting 32 degrees in the afternoon and the evening, and our bedroom was not far off. While we had the luxury of opening up space in the window in our bedroom at night, one other interesting fact about it is that here in Ireland, it is daylight until about 10:30 at night. So your circadian rhythm was completely off, where you were too hot, it was too bright, and it was combining to this factor that you just could not sleep. This resulted in something I never would have believed you. You had told me even just less than a year ago before moving to Ireland, which is that I'd be complaining about too many days of 28 degrees Celsius and sunshine, but here we were. My coworkers and I found us commiserating over the past couple of weeks every morning about just being so tired from the lack of sleep the day before, and just really happy, honestly, to come into the air-conditioned office that we have. Counting ourselves really lucky just to be able to have that space, but knowing that we were going back home to the same low situation just because the heat wave just kept on going on and on. And certainly, as I'm sure some of our Canadian listeners will resonate with, there's also this kind of darker side too, where we would be sitting out sometimes, and I was able to have that familiar smell, sadly, of forest fires. And that's because we also have not had rain here. So we know we're seeing those headlines from the UK, from Ireland now, and then obviously certainly back home, but this is not necessarily a reality that you would have associated with Ireland even just a few years ago. So here's where it gets really interesting from an industry perspective. And again, the area I work, I do want to note, is more in the commercial building side and not residential, but it was a lived experience that I had here, and certainly one that I wanted to talk about. I wanted to share just how uncommon air conditioning is here in Ireland and certainly parts of Europe. So I went into this deep rabbit hole as I was hot one night as to how uncommon air conditioning is here and in different parts of Europe. So for context, in the US, about 90% of all homes have air conditioning. In Canada, more recent figures are showing kind of close to 70%. It really depends on the province. So for example, Ontario tends to have closer to 80%. Provinces that are a little bit more moderate temperature, like British Columbia, it's less than half, but they will likely be facing a very similar situation to Ireland. France, where I have a lot of colleagues, certainly is seeing heat at a whole different level. We were high 20s here. They were high 30s, even 40s. They are now up to about a quarter of all homes have air conditioning. This number has nearly doubled in less than a decade. And then when you look at broader Europe, we're talking about 19 to 20%, but again, probably with a number of countries following a similar path and experience pattern as Ireland. I also want to note, because the number of 70% in Canada undoubtedly reflects much of the population that is living along the Canadian-US border, it is also important to keep in mind that probably as prolonged heat becomes an increasing problem, we will see situations of eco-justice where there are concerns of many of our Indigenous communities that are not necessarily in those city centers, that don't necessarily get the same access to the technology needed to be able to withstand these prolonged heat periods. And I want to contrast this again. I'm so privileged to be able to have these experiences of living and working in different places. But this past spring, I had to go to Singapore for work. And while it was 39 degrees Celsius every single day and almost 100% humidity, it felt far more bearable in the sense that whether you're getting in a taxi, a hotel, an office, everything was perfectly air conditioned. Even the public transport system, when you walk by the different train systems, which was phenomenal, they were all air conditioned as well. So workers were emerging, feeling fine, and able to go to the office space. Truly, they view air conditioning not as a luxury, but as table stakes in those countries. And that's really the whole story, is that certain countries and parts of the world built that technology in from basically the time it was available because the built infrastructure required it and needed it at the time. And now we're seeing so many different countries that did not necessarily have that reality who are trying to catch up. And admittedly, they're going to have to do that probably faster than they expected. And this is where the two worlds really collide, because I have been so focused on the benefit of our industry helping reduce the energy consumption of a built space and less so on the comfort side. I honestly used to think of them as kind of two separate columns, where one was very emission driven and the other one was more, and maybe even cost driven, and the other side was maybe a little bit fluffier. But as buildings and the people inside of them are being asked to withstand hotter environments for longer periods of time, these two worlds are going to overlap. And these two concepts truly become one. Occupant comfort goes from being a want and truly moves over to the world of being a need. And the moment a country like Ireland has to retrofit all of its homes, its hospitals, its schools, its commercial offices, its hotels to adopt to these new heat patterns, energy demands through air conditioning are just going to go through the roof, put a tremendous amount of pressure on the grid. And the emissions factor here in Ireland is going to lead to even more emissions within the country, which is exactly the kind of strain that our industry can help with. In other words, the humble HVAC controls, software, and sensors that I've been championing for on the environmental side for years is equally going to play an important role in helping keeping building occupants safe and comfortable as we see more climate change and more extreme weather patterns. These two use cases that I used to really rank as individual now truly are merging into the one. So going forward, I'm going to carry both pieces of this puzzle with equal pride. The environmental considerations, as well as the human comfort it protects. Because the reality is that they were never truly in competition. I just hadn't lived through the moment that made it that obvious. I'm sharing all of this because the reality is it's extremely rare, I think, to have one of these kind of fundamental realizations 13 years into an industry. And you've all been on this sustainability journey of my own for the past few years. So I wanted to make sure that I was being honest and sharing this, I guess, progress or evolution with you as well. That's really what the show has been about since day one, which is honest conversations, a little bit warts and all, and having these honest conversations in real time with people who are trying to build something better. Thanks for listening, and thanks for being on this ride with me. Look forward to seeing you on the next episode. I hope that you've enjoyed this week's edition of the Resilience Report. If you would like to hear and see more, be sure to check out @The Resilience Report on YouTube, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Until we connect again, remember, even on the darkest of days, we all have the opportunity to be a lighthouse for others as we collectively pursue better, more resilient business.